Miko Peled, a voice for Palestine from Israel. Miko Peled is a peace activist who dares to say in public what others still choose to deny. He has credibility, so when he debunks myth that Jews around the world hold with blind loyalty, people listen. Miko was born in Jerusalem in 1961 into a well-known Zionist family. His grandfather, Dr. Abraham Katznelson, was a Zionist leader and a signatory to the Israeli Declaration of Independence. His father, Matityahu Peled, was a young officer in the War of 1948 and a general in the War of 1967. When Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and the Sinai, Miko's unlikely opinions reflect his father's legacy. General Peled was a war hero turned peacemaker.
Palestine must be free, it can be free, and if we do our job, Palestine will be free, and much sooner than most people think.
Miko Peled is the author of The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Peled's The General's Son combines a wealth of knowledge and experience with a strong sense of human compassion and common sense. And with a compelling and forceful narrative, Peled has written a story that needs to be read by anyone interested in Palestine-Israeli relations and the broader Middle East in general.
It's an honor to be here. Honored guests, members of the diplomatic mission, members of the committee, Your Excellency, Mr. President, or Speaker of the House. It's a real honor to be here in Sri Lanka. I've wanted to come to Sri Lanka for a very long time, so when the email arrived to invite me, I was very excited. But I knew for certain that this was going to be unique. This visit was going to be unique and was going to be very successful when I disembarked the plane around 3 o'clock in the morning to be welcomed by His Excellency, the Palestinian ambassador, as that early in the morning, and being welcomed by him in Hebrew, nonetheless. So thank you for that gesture. And then later on, His Excellency, the co-president of the committee, was there too to greet us. And that was probably the warmest welcome I've had in visiting any country. So I thank you for that. And again, I thank you all for being here and for caring. The issue of Palestine, I believe, requires more than solidarity. And I think it's important to have a day of solidarity, certainly, but solidarity is not enough. There's a video that has been out on, on the internet for several days now. It's an interview with a Palestinian mother who lives in a small, poor community in the Jordan River Valley. And she speaks about the hardships of her life, the Israeli military destroying their little community, destroying their home over and over again. And finally, at the end, she says, "We don't want your sacks of rice. We don't want your sacks of flour. We need you to secure our safety. We need you to secure our children's future, because this can no longer go on." So having solidarity and expressing solidarity with Palestine is important. But if we express the solidarity with Palestine on the one hand and conduct business as usual with Israel on the other hand, my friends, we're defeating the purpose. We need more than solidarity. We need to heed the call of Palestinians to impose boycott, divestment, sanctions, and isolation on the state of Israel. That is what we need to be doing. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. What I'm really here to do is to tell you two stories that are intertwined. One is the story of the occupation of Palestine, an occupation that's been going on for 70 years and in which my family played a significant part. And the other story is the story of my family and how that story relates to the issue of Palestine. And the other thing that I'd like to spend some time on today is to add context to the issue of Palestine so that we're clear on the beginning of the conflict, we're clear where we stand today, and perhaps most importantly, we are clear on a path to end the conflict, which is something that I think is too often avoided. So I'd like to begin with the following question. Is Palestine one country, are Palestine and Israel one country or two? We hear about Palestine and Israel. I've heard people who told me that they visited Palestine and they visited Israel. Yesterday, during an interview, I was asked about Palestine and about Israel, as though these are two places. And I think that begs the question, are Palestine and Israel two different places? Because when I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I spent a great deal of time in Palestine. In fact, I was just there throughout the whole month of October. And I've yet to see this state of Palestine that people talk about, that people have recognized. Where is the state of Palestine? What are its boundaries? What is its capital city? Who are the citizens? Now, what we do see is, very clearly, that there's a country called Palestine, and it's certain parts of the world that's called Israel, but it's the same country. The same country that has two names. It's very clear that in Palestine, in this country, there are two nations, Palestinians and Israelis. But where is this other state? Because all I see when I'm there is the Israeli government who determines the lives of everyone who lives there. The Israeli army who maintains this brutal occupation and the existence of the state of Israel. And the question that this begs as well are, why are we talking about peace talks? There's one state, there's one army, so why is there need for peace talks? We know there's a conflict, but usually peace talks, and we know that peace talks have been going on for a very long time, peace talks mean that we have two countries at war, two armies at war. Well, where is the Palestinian army? Where is that Palestinian state? And I think what becomes clear when we ask these questions is that we're not talking about a war which requires peace talks. We're talking about oppression and occupation which require resistance. Which is why I said earlier, solidarity is good, but it's not enough. There is a call for Palestinian resistance. There is a Palestinian resistance that's been going on for a very long time, and that is what we need to support if we truly seek an end to this conflict. Now let's talk a little bit about context. We hear suddenly that there are rockets flying out of Gaza. We hear suddenly Palestinians are stabbing Israelis. We hear suddenly Israeli forces are invading Jenin or Nablus or Khalil, Hebron. And there's never any context. We hear that suddenly Israel is attacking Gaza, blowing up homes and people in Gaza. But there's never really any context. And there is this myth out there that the conflict in Palestine has been going on for centuries, for thousands of years perhaps, that those people over there are incapable of peace. They've been killing each other forever. But this is not true. If we truly want to see, if we truly want to understand and point out the cause for the violence in Palestine, we need to look no further than the racism and colonialism that came to Palestine from Europe. There is this statement out there, this document out there called the Balfour Declaration. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. Balfour Declaration. Every city in the state of Israel has a Balfour Street. You would think that Balfour was one of the prophets. People talk about the Balfour Declaration with such a sense of sanctity, you'd think it was one of the 10th commandments. But what is this Balfour Declaration and why do we take it so seriously? Lord Balfour, who I'm sure you know, was the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, gave a promise, gave a note to a Jewish millionaire friend of his by the name of Rothschild, promising Palestine as a homeland for the Jewish people, very few of whom actually lived there. Neither one of these people lived there. Neither one of these two men had any right to Palestine. But we had one white European racist offering another white European racist his country, somebody else's country. But in those days, it was all right. That's how things were done. White Europeans felt that they could take other people's lands and do with it as they will. And of course, I don't need to tell people in Sri Lanka about colonialism. Then we move on several decades later, in fact, the 68th anniversary of the United Nations Partition Plan takes place. And this is quite typical, actually, of the West. There's a problem. We say, well, we'll give some of the country to the Jews, some of the countries to the Arabs, and everything is going to sort itself out. It's going to be fine. But the United Nations Partition Resolution, the partition of Palestine, was actually very strange in many regards. First of all, look at the map. Can you imagine drawing a map of two states that looks like this? Can you imagine managing, securing boundaries that look like this? It almost seems as though whoever drew the map had too much to drink the night before and was still not completely coherent. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that in 1947, at the end of 1947, the entire Jewish community in Palestine was about 500,000 people. These were mostly the generation of my grandparents who came to Palestine from Europe to colonize it. And then the generation of my parents who were born there. About 500,000 people, mostly people who had almost literally just come off the boat. The indigenous Palestinian community was 3 times as large. 3 times as large. Yet in the partition plan, the United Nations allotted the smaller portion of the country to the larger Palestinian community, and the larger portion to the much smaller Israeli Jewish community. And somebody thought that this was going to work. And even today, 68 years later, we still hear people say, well, you know, the reason we have a conflict is the Palestinians' fault. They rejected the partition plan. This was a perfectly reasonable plan, and they rejected it. Would any nation not reject such an absurd idea? Was there really an expectation that this could work? And of course, this never took place. This map never materialized. Now, another crucial element of this conflict that takes place immediately from this point on is that from this point on we have 2 narratives begin. 2 narratives are established from that point on. We've got the Israeli Zionist narrative that talks about the revival of the Jewish people, that talks about how the Arabs attacked the small fledgling Jewish state because they wanted to kill the Jews. We hear about the heroism of the small Jewish community in Palestine, which fought the evil Arabs and defeated them, and this only several years after the Holocaust. But of course, being that we, the Israelis, are descendants of King David, who defeated Goliath, this is in our nature. We hear on the one hand a story of heroism and revival that is unmatched, that is once again very similar to stories that we hear, that we read about in the Bible. On the other hand, there's the Palestinian narrative that talks about destruction, ethnic cleansing, terrorism, and occupation. And how do you bridge this gap? A story of revival or occupation, ethnic cleansing? Go try to bridge this gap between these 2 narratives. Unless we are fully clear about what took place from that point on, there is no way that we can understand what is happening today, and there's no way that we can see a way out of the conflict. Now, what I was raised upon, of course, is the Zionist story. What most people in the West have accepted is the Zionist story, is the Zionist narrative. But thankfully, about 20 years ago, Israeli historians, Ilan Pappé is the chief of those historians, but there are several others, Israeli historians decided to look into the Zionist narrative and decided to look into the Israeli version of events, and they raised a few questions. Chief among these questions was this. At the end of 1947, it is well known, well recorded, that the Jewish community in Palestine had developed a very strong, well-armed, well-trained armed force. A militia, an armed militia. This militia, in which my father was a young officer, numbered about 40,000 well-trained, well-armed men. When we look at the Palestinian community, we see no such thing. We see no equivalent. So how could the Palestinians have attacked, and what did the Palestinians attack with, if there was no armed force? And Ilan Pappé and the other Israeli historians continue. And they say, in fact, it was not the Palestinians, it was not the Arabs who began the attack after the decision in 1947. It was the Zionist militia, it was the Jewish militias who began this massive attack. Within weeks, a massive attack that today would only be called terrorism and ethnic cleansing. Before the end of 1947, almost 75,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes. Before even 1947 ended. By the end of 12 months, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. Almost the entire country was conquered by this militia. And hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of Palestinians, towns and villages were destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. And this is according to Israeli historians. Never mind the Palestinians have been telling this story for decades. But in the West, we can't believe Palestinians because they're Arabs, of course. We can only believe the story when an Israeli historian confirms it. Now, like I say, go try to bridge this gap and go try to move forward without discussing these issues. Without discussing the issue of what happened immediately after this fateful resolution to partition Palestine. Now, another one of the claims that is very often heard, certainly in Israel, but also generally in the West, and that is that even if there was such thing as a Palestine, even if a few Palestinians perhaps were kicked out, there was really nothing there. There was nothing to speak of. Any civilization, anything worth mentioning that existed in Palestine in 1948 was brought by the Jewish immigration or colonization of Palestine. This is the city of Jaffa. The city of Jaffa was a city on the coast of the Mediterranean, a city of about 120,000 people, a city with a rich business life, a rich political life, a real cultural life. Several newspapers were printed in Jaffa, movie theaters, concert halls. Some of the greatest names in the Arab world will come and perform at the Jamal Basha Theater in Jaffa. And this thriving city on the coast of the Mediterranean, in the spring of 1948, in a matter of 2 weeks, was reduced to 3,000 people, all concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wires and Israeli guards surrounding them. And the reality is that today in Tel Aviv, there is still a Palestinian community. This Palestinian community is neglected, oppressed, lives under racist laws, and constantly harassed by the Israeli security services. Now, that community of Palestinians are Israeli citizens. There are Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. And the larger story here is not necessarily just the story of the city of Jaffa. The larger story is this. We cannot reduce Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza because Jaffa is part of Palestine. And Haifa in the north is part of Palestine. And the Negev Desert in the south is part of Palestine. And certainly Jerusalem is a part of Palestine. Palestinians live over the whole entire country. And Palestinians suffer the same oppression, the same consequences of the occupation, whether they live in any one of these places, albeit they live under different laws. And that is the greater story here. Now, I think it's crucial that we speak about, that we spend a moment or two, maybe if I do it this way, no, it's not working, that we spend a moment or two talking about the Gaza Strip. What is this thing called the Gaza Strip? Where did it come from? Is it some kind of a natural boundary? Is it some kind of a natural strip that existed way, generations before? Why are there so many people living in this Gaza Strip? If we don't understand what happened in 1948, we will not understand why there's a Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip was created by Israel as a place to house the hundreds of thousands of refugees that were the victims of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. They had to be herded somewhere, and in the early 1950s, as the ethnic cleansing was finishing up, these refugees were herded into refugee camps along or around the city of Gaza, on the coast of the Mediterranean. And a line was drawn, and this was the Gaza Strip. Now, we've heard over recent years there's been a great deal of violence, particularly from Israel, initiated by Israel, in the Gaza Strip. Attacks on the Gaza Strip began as soon as the Gaza Strip was established. The Gaza Strip was actually delineated and finalized in the early 1950s, and as soon as the Gaza Strip was established, Israeli attacks began in the Gaza Strip. Israeli commandos would enter the Gaza Strip and attack. And in the beginning, the reason that was given was that they were infiltrators. Now, after Israel completed the ethnic cleansing and defined the Gaza Strip, it also passed a law thank you. It passed laws that made it illegal and impossible for Palestinians to return. Well, Palestinians living in poverty tried to return to their homes, return to their land. From time to time, they would enter in order to execute acts of violence as a part of their resistance. And Israel would enter with huge force and extract a huge price in civilian casualties. This was in the early 50s. Later on, they stopped calling them infiltrators and they started calling them fedayeen. Later on, they stopped calling them fedayeen and they started calling them terrorists. Today, they don't call them terrorists, they call them Hamas. The names of the devil that exists in Gaza changes all the time. The technology of the Israeli military changes as well. So whereas in the beginning they were killing dozens and then hundreds, last summer, in 51 days, Israel murdered over 2,000 innocent civilians in Gaza in 51 days in front of our very eyes. So the technology improves. But the reality in Gaza hasn't changed. The reality in Gaza is still people who are refugees, who want to go back to their homes, who are suffering from violence, who are suffering from poverty, who are suffering from unemployment, all of which are imposed upon them by Israel. Because education levels in Gaza are very high. Gaza literacy rate is over 90%, 92%, one of the highest literacy rates in the world. So you have to ask yourself, such high literacy rate, why is there unemployment? Why is there poverty? Because a siege has been imposed on Gaza, even before the actual siege. And a brutal oppression and occupation are imposed on Gaza by Israel. And on a regular basis, for 7 decades, the Israeli military goes into Gaza and murders civilians. And then they claim it's self-defense. And they get away with it. They claim it's self-defense and they get away with it. In Israel, certainly in the West, in America, and other places, you hear all the politicians, all the talking heads talking about Israel's right to defend itself. And you look at the images. After millions of tons of bombs are dropped from the air, you look at the images in Gaza. You see the destruction. You see the death toll. You see the injured. Self-defense? Everybody, excuse me, with half a brain knows that there has never been a threat to Israeli security from the Gaza Strip. There's never been a tank in Gaza. There's never been an F-16 in Gaza. There's never been a regular army in Gaza. Where's the threat? What are they defending themselves? From what? Yet they managed to get away with it somehow. And then the world wants to find out if war crimes took place. So they send a committee into Gaza to find out if war crimes were committed. What do they think happens when millions of tons of bombs hit civilians? This is not a war crime. We need a committee for this? This is the insanity of this situation. This is the insanity of how the world treats Palestinians and how the world treats the lives of Palestinians. We need a committee to find out of war crimes. 40,000 Israeli reservists were called up. 40,000. We were there just as the war was taking place, This massacre was taking place. We drove down along the boundary of Gaza, and there's one entry on the south from which the Israeli ground forces were coming in. You never saw so many tanks in your life. You thought it was World War II all over again, that the Germans are back or something. Why do they need so many tanks? Why do they need 40,000 troops? To do what? And the question that begs to be asked is why? Why is Israel attacking and murdering people in Gaza for 70 years? People who have never posed a threat, who are possibly incapable of posing a threat. This is a question that begs to be asked and nobody's asking. Why is Israel attacking and murdering people in Gaza for 70 years? Have they not suffered enough? And I believe the answer has to do not with a threat to Israeli security, but with a threat to Israel's legitimacy. Because the existence of this reality, which already is a humanitarian crisis, 5 minutes away from Israeli cities where people live a completely normal life, where you wouldn't dream of not having electricity as much as you want or clean water as much as you want from the tap. 5 minutes from there, you have Palestinians living without clean water. 2 million people almost, without access to medicine, without access to nutrition. That is a threat to Israeli legitimacy. 30 minutes from Jerusalem, where people have all the comforts. There are close to 2 million people living in a humanitarian catastrophe. And that is why they need to be killed, because Israel has only two options: to solve the problem, to allow the refugees to return, to build Gaza again with the $3 billion it gets from America. But they don't want to do that. We don't want Arabs back in Israel. So the only other option is to kill them and then blame them for being terrorists. And then somehow Israel manages to get away with it. So that's the option that Israel chooses: to attack them and kill them for 70 years and keep them in one of the largest concentration camps the world has ever known, which is the Gaza Strip. And this is happening every day, including today, as we all sit here and talk about solidarity. Unless we get serious about punishing Israel, about isolating Israel, about imposing boycotts and divestment against Israel, this will never change. People in Gaza will continue to die. And it is up to us, people who are, as they say, rich, free, and alive, all at the same time, to do something about this. And it is up to us today to do something about this. Now, I'm going to change the tone a little bit and tell you a little bit, got to go over a little bit to my own personal story, because people always ask, well, you're an Israeli, what are you doing talking like this? So, the title of my book is The General Son, but the subtitle is A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Now, what does that mean, a journey of an Israeli in Palestine? Israel and Palestine is the same place. So geographically, this is not a serious journey, but it's a journey from the sphere of the colonizer to the sphere of the colonized, from the sphere of the oppressor to the sphere of the oppressed. And that is a huge journey psychologically, emotionally. And I think the journey actually began with the following story when I was a child. It has to do with my mother, and I talk about this in the book. In 1948, my mother was 22 years old. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. She was living in Jerusalem, and she was already a mother. My father was fighting for the cause. And the story that she told me many, many times as I was growing up has to do with an experience that she had had at that time. When the Israeli forces came and took the Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and I'm not talking about the old city of Jerusalem, I'm talking about the communities that were built outside of the old city and what later on became Israel. Israeli forces came in, took these neighborhoods, forced the Palestinians to leave, and these very homes of these communities, very beautiful homes, these are well-to-do communities, these very homes were offered to Israeli families. And my mother, as a young mother who lived at the time in a small apartment with her parents, was offered one of these homes, and she refused. She's 98 years old today. We still talk about this. And she still has the same reaction when she talks about this. And she says, how could I possibly take the home of another mother? How could I possibly move into the home of another family which now lives in exile? Can you imagine how much they must miss their home? And then she goes on to describe the Israeli forces coming and looting, because these are well-to-do families. In fact, the homes are still there, beautiful homes. So there was furniture, and there were rugs, and there were books, and all kinds of wonderful things that were being looted by the Israelis. And she goes on to describe this. Now, for me as a child growing up, hearing this story presented a serious problem, although I couldn't quite understand it as a child. And as I began to work on the book and speak to her more about this, I began to understand what the problem was, why this was presenting a story. Her personal narrative, her personal experience was contradicting the national narrative. It was contradicting the national Jewish Zionist narrative. The Zionist narrative says this: we are the Jewish people, and this is the land of Israel, so it's our country. We've been gone for 2,000 years, but we're back. So the country is ours. The United Nations decided to partition Palestine. We accepted because we're gracious people, we're generous people, and we allowed the Arabs to stay in parts of this country, which is ours. The Arabs rejected this idea and attacked us. Now, being that we're smarter and better than they are, we defeated them, fair and square. And then we asked them to stay, and they left. We begged them, in fact, to stay, and they left. So where's the moral dilemma? They left. There's an empty home. There's a family that needs a home. Why was my mother presenting a moral dilemma where there's clearly no moral dilemma? That is what I could not understand. You see, the Zionist narrative always ends up morally on top, somehow. There was a massive campaign of terrorism and ethnic cleansing, but it's okay because we were back after 2,000 years. Last summer, Israel murdered over 2,000 innocent civilians in cold blood in Gaza, but that's okay because Hamas is in Gaza and Hamas is the devil. So it's okay. It is exactly the same narrative. And I, as a boy, was trying to grasp this. And again, it wasn't until I was much older and I was actually working on the book that I was able to understand why there was a problem. Now, moving back a little bit into this whole, the more political aspect of this, there's this idea out there, a myth, I would say, that the occupation of Palestine began in 1967. That the occupied Palestinian territories are these two little areas that were determined by Israel, called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and this is Palestine. This is occupied Palestine. And I look at the map and I scratch my head and I think, wait a minute. What happened in 1948 was not an occupation? The territories that were occupied in 1948 and became the land of Israel are not occupied lands? What, we have amnesia? We forgot that there were people who were forced out and this land was taken illegally? Only these two little areas, by the way, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, were two areas that Israel determined. And in 1948, they chose, for their own reasons, not to take those, to leave the Gaza Strip and the West Bank outside of the borders of Israel. For their own reasons. 20 years later, 1967, they found a reason to take it, and they took it. 1967 was not the beginning of the occupation of Palestine. It was the completion of the occupation of Palestine. In 1967, Israel completed the occupation of Palestine by taking the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They had intended to do it, the army was ready to do it and intending to do it long before that. They decided to do it when they did, and they took it. This notion that somehow these territories are unique, that they're different, is absurd. As soon as Israel took the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1968, in 1967, they did exactly what they did in other parts of the country 20 years earlier. They kicked out Palestinians. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced into exile from the West Bank. And they built cities and towns and highways and industry and infrastructure and villages for Jews only on Palestinian land. How is that different from what is happening in the rest of Israel? How is the West Bank different? All of Israel is occupied Palestine. All Israeli cities and towns are illegal settlements. But there's this idea out there. The occupation of Palestine began in 1967. Someone was saying to me, oh, it's almost the 50th anniversary of the occupation. And again, I scratch my head. 50? From 1948? It's 67 years. It's almost 7 decades. What do you mean 50 years? Oh no, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Two little parts of Palestine. But that is the myth that's out there. Palestine is the West Bank. Jaffa, Haifa, Ramle, all these other places, the Negev Desert, Palestinians are everywhere. This is not Palestine. What is it? It's occupied Palestine. And I think it's crucial to understand. The state of Israel did not take the West Bank by mistake. They did not build cities and towns for Jews only there by mistake. This is part of the completion of the occupation and the creation of a Jewish state, a state for Jews only in Palestine. And this is crucially important. This idea that Israel would somehow allow the Palestinians to establish a state somewhere within what they consider the land of Israel is absurd. It's an absurd notion. They didn't take it by mistake, and they didn't do anything that they did. People are still upset. Oh, they took more lands in East Jerusalem. They're building another neighborhood somewhere in the West Bank. Of course they are. They're doing it everywhere. You think Palestinians inside of 1948, inside of the other part of Palestine, this isn't happening? They're not taking their land, is not being taken away still? It is all Palestine, it is all occupied, it is all illegal. There is no difference between these. Now, what's interesting is this. We hear about the war of 1967 that Israel was under an existential threat, that Israel had no choice but to attack. And like you heard before, my father was a young officer in 1948. He was the general in 1967. He was a member of the Israeli High Command. So naturally, when I was working on the book, I chose to go into the Israeli Army archives to read about him, his work, his career, and so on. And particularly interesting are the minutes of the meetings of the Israeli High Command leading up to this war, to the war of 1967. A lot of people have written about it. Documentaries have been made about it. Myths have been written about it. This was a very interesting time. And as I began reading these minutes, they're available in the archives, I could not believe my eyes. With everything that's been written about this, there was still probably one of the most important aspects of these meetings that was not written anywhere. So of course I wrote it in my book. Something my father says in the meetings, and then the other generals concur, and that is that the Arab armies are not prepared for war. And therefore, this is a good time to attack. Now, talking particularly about the Egyptian military, because the Egyptian army was really the only significant army. The other Arab armies were less of a threat, less of an issue for the Israelis. And they're saying the Egyptian army, this is all the top people, the top generals, the top commanders of the Israeli army saying, the Egyptian army will need at least another 1.5 to 2 years before they're prepared for war. This is 1967. Therefore, we attack now. This myth that there was an existential threat, they discuss as well. And they say, even though this is true, we need to perpetuate this lie that there is an existential threat. And that way to press the government and press the people to this feeling that they have to begin the attack, to get the permission to attack. And I remember as a child, everybody believed that the Arabs were coming to kill us and rape us and slaughter us. The only people who knew that this was a lie were the Israeli generals. And then this existential threat was over in 6 days. Another biblical kind of motive for you. In 6 days, these massive armies that were amassed were wiped out in 6 days. 18,000 Arab soldiers were killed in those 6 days. About 700 Israeli soldiers were killed. Now, every soldier is somebody's son. Every soldier has a mother and a father, so we cry for all of them. But the difference between 18,000 and 700 speaks to where the threat was really lied. And then as soon as these lands were taken, as soon as they were taken, within minutes, Israeli bulldozers were destroying Palestinian neighborhoods, Palestinian towns, and building Israeli settlements. Now, the story of my father is an interesting one, beginning from that point on, because he stood up at the first meeting of the Israeli High Command after the war. He stood up and he said, we now need to make peace with the Palestinians. We now need to allow the Palestinians to establish their own state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This will be a Palestinian state, an Arab state that we can make peace with, and this will be a bridge to making peace and living a normal life for us as a Jewish state. He said, if we don't do this now, then there will be resistance, we will become a cruel occupier, and eventually there will no longer be a Jewish state, it'll become a binational state. Of course, he said this in 1967, that's exactly what happened from that day on until today. And he went on and retired about a year later, moved on to another career, but he continued to pursue this idea of what today we know is called the two-state solution. That's when it was born. He and several other Israelis began to promote this idea that we need to recognize the rights of the Palestinians to self-determination in these two little areas called the West Bank and Gaza. And that's going to be the key to peace. What's interesting is that at some point they were contacted by major figures within the PLO, major Palestinian leaders, Yasser Arafat's closest allies, or some of his closest allies, who wanted to pursue this idea and see if maybe there was something to it. So they contacted my father and his group, and they began meetings. At first it was very, a lot of suspicion, nobody was sure who was talking to who and what the deal was. I talk about it in the book. But they met, and they continued to meet. On the Palestinian side, you had official members of the PLO, people like Said Hamami and Issam Sartawi. These were major figures, major ambassadors of the PLO in European countries. And then you had the Israelis, like my father, who were really renegades. They didn't represent anyone. Israel wanted nothing to do with this. They wanted nothing to do with this Israeli government. And the challenge was, on the one hand, to convince the Israelis to recognize the PLO, and on the other hand, to convince Yasser Arafat to drop the struggle, to drop the idea of a right of return, and recognize Israel and settle for the two-state solution. And as we know, eventually he was convinced to do that, or pressured to do that. And then we had the Oslo Accords. And it's too bad that I don't have the image for that, but I'll describe this image to you, okay? As the leaders walking up to the signing of the Oslo Accords in the White House. This Oslo Agreement. It was a moment of promise. There was a sense that there was a lot of promise, there was a lot of potential. Soviet Union had fallen, apartheid had fallen in South Africa, the Berlin Wall came down. There was a sense that now Palestine's turn. But we look at the picture and we see this group of men led by an American president. First of all, we know that no American can become president unless they support Israel 150%. So that already tells us something about the outcome. Then representing Israel was Yitzhak Rabin. And a lot of people said, Yitzhak Rabin, this old war horse, he must have changed. He didn't change. He was a war criminal that should have been led to the International Criminal Court. But instead he was given a Nobel Peace Prize. But never mind that. And he was representing Israel. And nothing good could come out of that. That's absolutely clear. You know, and King Hussein of Jordan was there, and President Mubarak of Egypt were there, and they were all trying to put this together. But it was very, very clear that nothing good could come out of that. And people today talk about the failure of Oslo. The Oslo process failed. I would argue that the Oslo was an astounding success. Oslo Accords did exactly what they were set out to do. Destroy Palestinian society, destroy the fabric of Palestinian political life, strengthen Israeli hold on the land, the people, and the resources. And that's exactly what happened since Oslo. It was another catastrophe for the Palestinians. It was a promise that led to catastrophe. And that's exactly how Yitzhak Rabin, certainly in the Israelis, intended it to be. That's exactly what they intended to do, and that's exactly what we see today. A catastrophe for the Palestinians. What we see today is directly as a result of what Oslo was about. There was certainly no intention on the Israeli part, on the Israeli side, to allow the Palestinians any kind of rights, or certainly not a state. Now, there's another part of this conflict that is rarely discussed, and that is the issue of the Palestinian prisoners. Israel holds thousands of Palestinian prisoners. I think the current number is 7,000 Palestinian prisoners. And according to Israeli sources, the vast majority of Palestinians held in Israeli jails were never charged with acts of violence. Never charged with acts of violence. And this is the Israeli military court, where the standard is set very low. So if they were not charged with acts of violence, they were charged with acts of political resistance. In other words, these are political prisoners. Political prisoners. Yet, of course, Israel, of course, calls them terrorists. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single Palestinian family that does not have a family member who was either currently or was in prison. Now, we forget for a moment, easily forget, that the world recognizes the rights of people to resist. We recognize the rights of people who live under oppressive regimes, colonialist regimes, foreign occupation, to resist. The Palestinian resistance, for some reason, is not considered resistance. It's considered something else. If they were not Palestinians, they'd be considered heroes. If Israel doesn't like rockets coming out of Gaza, Israel can change the situation tomorrow morning by allowing the people of Gaza the freedom they deserve. The problem are not the Qassam rockets and Hamas. Hamas is a resistance organization. Hamas would never have been established if it wasn't for the occupation, just like the other resistance groups. But it's much easier to blame the victim and call them a terrorist. But the world recognizes the rights of people to resist, except when they're Palestinians. Palestinians are not allowed to be heroes, they're only allowed to be victims. And if we look at the way Palestinians fought this massive war machine in Gaza last year, in 2014, Palestinians fought against them, this massive war machine. Heroically, young Palestinians fought. But again, we're not allowed to call them heroes, we can only call Palestinians terrorists. But this is the reality. I'll share another piece of my own personal story for you, because this is, again, was the final really push for me personally to get involved in this issue. It was September 1997, and my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. It was an attack that was ordered and executed by Hamas in Jerusalem, September the 4th, 1997. Now, if you remember, some of you are old enough to remember the 90s, the mid and late 90s, there was a lot of violence going on. There was a lot of bloodshed. And this was very big news. Every time there was any kind of violence, an explosion, of course, it's always big news. This particular case was even bigger news because one of the victims was the granddaughter of a famous general. My father, Peled. Not only was he a general, he was also a general who became known for his efforts to make peace with Palestinians. So this was very big news. I was living in the US at the time, so I took the first plane home. I reached my sister's apartment in Jerusalem, and it was packed with people who came to express their sorrow, Palestinians and Israelis, and it was packed with the press. Journalists from every part of the world, every language you can imagine, were there to cover this. And the questions that are always asked are, first of all, who's responsible, and then how do we punish them? How many of them do we kill in response? When my sister finally came out to talk to people, she answered these questions. The first thing she said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about killing more people. No real mother would want to see this grief fall upon any other mother. And if we want to know who's responsible, she said, who is it that's maintaining this brutal oppression of another nation? Who is destroying Palestinian homes? Who is denying Palestinians water? Who is killing Palestinian children in the schools? Who is incarcerating and throwing mothers and fathers and children in jail? Who's been doing this? We Israelis have been doing this. And this is the price that we pay. And both she and her husband said if we hold the Israeli government directly responsible for our daughter's death. And then they were accused of allowing Palestinians to come to their home. Somebody asked my sister, how can you let them come to your home at a time like this? The other side. How are you willing to speak to the other side? She said, I am not willing to speak to the other side. Because when the prime minister called and asked to visit, we told him he was not welcome. When the Israeli prime minister called, and this is customary that the prime minister, of course, visits families when things like this take place, and he called and he was told he was not welcome. By the way, it was Bibi Netanyahu. He was the prime minister then. So for me personally, hearing her say these words and reacting like this, of course, it had a huge impact. Now, I had to go back to the US where I lived, and what do? How do you go back to work the next day? You see this little girl that was just buried, that you know and love. How do you pick up the pieces? And my good fortune was that where I live in California, I found a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group, a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group that would meet once a month and talk about issues. So I joined. Now let me tell you this, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, which is a mixed city. That was the first time I met Palestinians. In California, I was 39 years old, and the chapter in the book that talks about this begins with the lines, my journey into Palestine began in California. Because if you've been to Jerusalem, you know Jerusalem is supposedly a mixed city, but it's one of the most racially segregated cities in the world. It's one of the most racist cities in the world. So as an Israeli, you don't see Palestinians. And this was true when I was growing up, and it's true even more so today. And then I began hearing this other narrative, this other story about 1948. Ethnic cleansing, forced exile, massacres, things that I said, this couldn't be. We don't do this. We're the good guys here. We're the Israelis. We don't do these things. We don't behave like this. But you sit with people long enough, and then you develop trust. So you think, well, they've got to be something to what they're saying. They can't all be lying. So then I began reading some of what these Israeli historians were writing, Ilan Pape and the others. And of course, they were validating what Palestinians were saying. And then I began venturing myself into Palestinian towns. And I describe in the book the first time I drove to a small village called Bil'ain in the West Bank. I was driving an Israeli car. I was by myself, easily identified as an Israeli. And it was absolutely clear to me that day I was going to die. Why? Because there's Arabs there, and they know I'm Israeli, and they're going to kill me. That's what Arabs do. I didn't even know I could think that way, but as I was driving, these demons, these crazy demons were beginning to flood my head. And the fear, I was sweating. Of course, I didn't turn back, thankfully. I've been there many, many times since. And that's what trust does. Once you develop more trust, it pushes the fear away. And then I've been able to do this. And of course, meeting Palestinians and discussing and learning about the issue is what shaped my perspective. But I think it's important to go beyond criticizing Israel. It goes beyond the delegitimizing Israel. We have to, as I said earlier, especially us who are rich, free, and alive all at the same time, we have to find hope in a situation that seems completely hopeless, and we have to pursue this hope with passion, with audacity, because it is our responsibility. Anybody who saw Jerusalem through the month of October, you cannot be more hopeless than that. I was there throughout October. Almost 100 people, innocent Palestinians, were murdered throughout the month of October, countless injured. Madness. I've never seen Jerusalem so depressed, so sad. But we can't afford to be hopeless. We do not have that luxury. We have to find hope, and the question is this: where does hope lie? Does hope lie in the state of Israel, a state that has racist laws, a state that's been maintaining a brutal military occupation for almost 70 years, a state that says that I have more rights than he does, a state that has exclusive rights for Jewish people, a state that's been an apartheid state from the very beginning? Does hope lie there? Is there any hope there? Or does hope lie in the creation of a democratic state, a democracy with equal rights for all its citizens, for all the people who live there? Where does hope lie? That is what we need to ask. I believe that just like apartheid fell in South Africa, and just like dictatorships fell and fascism fell in Europe, Zionism can fall and must fall in Palestine and be replaced with a democracy with equal rights. Without that, there will never be an end to the siege on Gaza. Without that, Palestinian prisoners will never be released. Without that, Palestinian refugees will never be allowed to return. This is the key step to allow all the other problems of Palestine to be resolved. But it requires that we speak up. It requires that we do not recognize the state of Israel. It requires that Israeli ambassadors be sent home. It requires that the Sri Lanka ambassador be called back from Tel Aviv, if there is one. It is called for action. It is called for isolation, for boycott. It's not going to happen on its own. Israel took the place of South Africa. It is a racist, violent apartheid regime. And it is upon us to do this. It's not popular, it's not easy, but it has to be done. It's not enough to have Palestine Solidarity Day and then buy weapons from Israel the next day and do trade with Israel the next day. It doesn't help. In fact, it makes things worse. That is where hope lies. Now, I want to end with this idea of a free Palestine. When we see the slogan, Free Palestine, when we see the stickers and the posters that say Free Palestine, what does that mean? What is a free Palestine? Free Palestine means all of Palestine, completely free. Free from Zionist regime, free from oppression, free from violence, free from racist laws. A state where all the people who live there, Palestinians and Israelis, can live in peace, because Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace. But the state of Israel will not allow peace. So you cannot have peace with Israel. You have to have peace between Israelis and Palestinians in a democratic regime. And like you heard in that little video, the clip that they had before, I will say this again. Palestine can be free. Palestine must be free, and Palestine will be free if we do our job. Thank you all very much.